Welcome back to the Game Collection. I'm SuperDerek, and this is Ys VIII. Ys VIII is the latest in a long-running series of action RPGs that date back to the beginning of the RPG genre. Developed by Nihon Falcom and published by Nipon Ichi Software, Ys VIII continues the tradition of fast-paced, action-packed combat, and above all else, fun. The game was originally released on the PlayStation Vita and PlayStation 4, but recently has been brought over to the Nintendo Switch, which is the version that I'm playing for this review. In Ys VIII, you play as Adol Christen, the red-haired swordsman. The story of Ys VIII takes place between the events of Ys V and VI, but it's important to note that you don't really have to have played any of the previous games to pick up and play Ys VIII. The game picks up with Adol and his best friend Dogi aboard the Lombardia, a passenger ship headed for Eresia. Unfortunately, misfortune upon the high seas sends the Lombardia to the bottom of the sea after an attack from a giant squid. Adol, Dogi, and some of the passengers aboard the Lombardia awaken upon a deserted island, a cursed island, from which no person has ever returned. It's up to Adol to try to gather the scattered castaways, fortify a settlement against the wilderness of the island, and uncover the mystery of this bizarre land. The concept of survival on a mysterious deserted island is one that I haven't seen play out too many times in RPG form, and when it does, it's usually only for a few short hours at most. This trope lends itself well to the exploration aspect of RPGs that I've been missing for a while.
What a beautiful view!
I think that towards the second half of the game, the story started to feel a little drawn out, relying to a disappointing degree on the convenient amnesia trope to keep the player in the dark, which felt a little tired. Aside from that caveat, the story was overall really well paced. Aside from the unique setting for Ys VIII, a lot of the story of the game was stuff that we've seen and played a few times before, and I'm not saying this is necessarily bad, I just wouldn't expect the game to be challenging anyone's worldviews anytime soon. To put it simply, if the game was an anime, it would be a shonen. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's just the kind of game where you sit down, plug in a few hours, and then put it down pretty easily. This in turn lends itself pretty well to being played on the Nintendo Switch or PlayStation Vita. That said, the characters are lovable and the humor was hit and miss unless you're a glut for flatulence jokes, in which case it was a gas.
That's why I don't like being dishonest. I've been true to myself for a long time, and I'm not stopping anytime soon.
And there were definitely some sad moments in the game that remind the player of what's really at stake, a stark contrast to the overall upbeat story up to that point. I think that the real draw for players of Ys VIII will be the solid, fluid action RPG gameplay though. At any point, the player may have 3 party members active, each of whom deal piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning type damage. enemies tend to be weak to one of these types of damage, and the player can switch between the controlled characters mid-battle. In addition to this, players may also hold the R button plus a face button to execute a skill that hits harder at the cost of some skill points. Using the L2 and R2 buttons, the player can dodge or parry, and with perfect timing, gain skill points and temporary invincibility. While the player controls a single character, the CPU will autopilot your active companions either defensively or offensively, which the player can also toggle on the fly. And they even seem to do a pretty good job of not dying all of the time, which is a breath of fresh air for this style of game. All in all, the battle mechanics and exploration mechanics feel sublime and intuitive once you've gotten the hang of the controls. Beyond that, there's a ton of little objectives that you can embark on. You can defend your settlement against attacks from the local wildlife, or go on the offensive to hunt down enemies on their own turf.
Alright, let's start fixing it. Don't let him break it again.
There are items to collect for crafting, materials for weapon improvement, and enemies to kill for armor and food production, and a lot more. I actually got a little addicted to looking for all of the treasures, trying to map the island like a professional cartographer, and locating recruiting castaways. However, sometimes navigating your way to a specific point on the map can feel impossible. The map can sometimes give you some information, but not enough to really make navigation easy. One of the main objectives within the game is to locate the castaway passengers and crew of the Lombardia, and this is an objective that works really well for the story, not just because it's a story about the hero doing heroic things, but because the people aboard the Lombardia actually have unique trades that allow them to be useful to you when you're at the castaway village. Certain villagers can be traded with, upgrade your equipment, create medicine, and the more castaways you rescue, the more areas they can help you explore.
I would hope so. What with my dad being a weaponsmith and all.
During raid and hunting events, castaways can also provide support to your team members during battle by firing catapults, dealing massive damage to your foes, providing healing to your allies, and restoring skill points, and so on. Despite taking place on a deserted island, the world within Ys VIII still felt huge. This isn't your typical deserted island, as it contains giant mountains, gigantic trees, a deep chasm bisecting the island, and ruins of a long-lost civilization. The game has petrified forests, dank swamps, and miles of gorgeous sandy beaches. It's actually surprising the developers were able to cram this much diversity into a single island that still felt mostly cohesive by the end of it all. The music within Ys VIII is also phenomenal. I've even featured it in a few recent videos because these themes get stuck in my head, and they rock so hard.
Let's go!
The dub for Ys VIII is also really great, but for fans of Japanese audio, NIS America will be releasing an update mid-July 2018 that adds the option. Visually, Ys VIII is really nothing to write home about in the current generation of 1080p 60 frames per second gaming, but aesthetically, I think it's not too bad. There were only a few times when I noticed any lowering of fidelity in some of the larger areas, and some areas where the grass and other flora looked pretty jagged, but the depth of field of the camera within the game actually helps hide some of that. The frame rate seems to be pretty constant overall. Even during the fast-paced combat, combos and skills kick off without a hitch and look pretty great. In comparing the game to the PS4 version, there doesn't really seem to be much of a difference between the two all in all. The game started off its life as a Vita title, and as such, most of the graphics in both versions are basically exactly that. The overall aesthetic of the island of Seirin was beautiful and lush, and it was a pleasure to get lost in for hours. While playing the game, I did notice a couple of instances of character dialogue overlapping, being played concurrently rather than consecutively, but nothing really game-breaking. With that in mind, NIS has also announced that a few updates are on the way to fix some of the minor bugs, one of which has already come out. Ys VIII was a fun and action-packed RPG that kept my attention for hours on end, and time just flew by, and for all these reasons, the game has easily earned itself a spot in the game collection.
Whoops! Must have flexed too hard.